Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I like to discuss today's nonsense in the Mail on Sunday, as an article reports that a number of Tory MPs, including some who called for Johnson to step down last year, are now wanting him back. In fact, if that's not crazy enough, there's even mention of a dream ticket with Nigel Farage for good measure. What is the prospect of this ever happening, and what does it say about the state of the party that MPs would seriously even consider it? But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So the fact that the main political piece in the Mail on Sunday today is of an attempted plan to bring Boris Johnson back to lead the party, with a side order of Nigel Farage, possibly in the House of Lords, to buy him off as well. And I had two immediate thoughts. The first was in dealing yet again with mention of regret at ousting Johnson in the first place. Like, I can appreciate there'll be some Tory MPs who think, look, things are way worse now than when Johnson was in charge, you know, for their party, if not the country. I appreciate that. And given that some acts clearly failed, they might see a second political life of Boris Johnson being not a terrible option for them. But if any Tory MP says, as according to this report they have, that they actually regret dropping Johnson in the first place, I think we can readily dismiss them as being thick beyond belief. I seem to have to keep reminding people that in the summer of 2022, as Boris Johnson resigned, he was facing a Privileges Committee investigation, which we now know resulted in him being found guilty of 5 different types of contempt of Parliament when he was only actually facing 1. He was so guilty that he committed 4 further types of contempt whilst unsuccessfully trying to defend himself against the original. The end result was a recommendation for a hefty suspension, well in excess of that needed to trigger a recall petition. And Tory MPs would not have blocked the punishment. Indeed, they did not. Remember that the reason they allowed the investigation in the first place was because they would be punished by the public for blocking it. So of course they weren't going to block the punishment. Boris Johnson was going to be suspended and then recalled from Parliament. Nothing was going to stop that. If Tory MPs had even tried to prop him up, they would have suffered very badly. You look at the polls now, and I can get how some Tory MPs think, well, it's way worse now than when Johnson was in charge. But although some of that damage was Liz Truss, and let's be honest, it was the Boris Johnson backers who backed her, some of it were just chickens coming home to roost from Johnson's time in office. It was always coming. The cost of living crisis was ramping up. That was going to happen with Johnson still in place. It was going to get worse. There was no stopping it. And imagine the extra scandals that would have kept coming if Johnson had remained in place. You know, he would, for example, he'd have stood by Nadhim Zahawi as Chancellor, even after being found guilty of tax evasion. What would he have done about the Northern Ireland Protocol? Would we now be in an unwinnable trade war with the EU and maybe even the United States? Because that's the way things were going. Any Tory MP who thinks it was feasible to have kept Johnson on has seemingly forgotten about all of these things. But my second thought was, how bad a state is the Tory party in, when the best option you can think of is to replace Sunak with the already disgraced Boris Johnson? The reason Johnson became their leader in the first place wasn't because they thought he'd be a great leader. It's because they thought he was the only person they had who was a skilled campaigner, who could win an election. The reason he clung on for so long was because they had no confidence in potential replacements. Johnson had purged the party of talent and made sure the most prominent roles went to feckless losers so they wouldn't be able to challenge him. The party replaced him with the 2 least feckless in their view, first Truss and then Sunak. Both have proved to be disastrous. And that's the best they had. So sure, I get that some will wish they could have Johnson back, but it's a shame they're not also thinking, but how did we end up in a situation where we've got no suitable leaders in the parliamentary party? There's 350 of them. How come none of them can lead the party? But those were just my initial thoughts. Is it actually feasible? There were some interesting insights in the report, and I am going to point out, this is a report in the Mail. They're quoting anonymously and sometimes not quoting at all, just paraphrasing. So for all I know, they're describing the narrative set by literally 2 or 3 MPs rather than a wider feeling within the party. But let's go over what some of these insights are. First, there was concern that the COVID inquiry could further damage Johnson's reputation with the public, but the article reports that there's a feeling that, he came through it quite well in the end, and he was the only person who came through questioning with credibility and who didn't try to throw others under the bus. And I'm thinking, were you high on drugs when you were watching it? He was torn to shreds by the questions, and he sought to throw literally everyone under the bus. I can't think of anyone he didn't blame, including the public. He did not accept responsibility for anything. The only regret he expressed was about consequences, not his decisions or actions. But you can see why Tory MPs would want to believe their fairy tale version of the COVID inquiry. And given that the media covered for him, it is actually probably fair to say that the inquiry is not, as yet anyway, going to damage Johnson's reputation with the public any more than it already has. Another insight was the fear that Nigel Farage would come back from the jungle and dominate the airwaves, they said, and Reform UK will climb much higher in the polls and the Conservatives will drop below 20 points. They say that then 5 or 10 Tory MPs will defect to Reform and that will be that. Now, I would say that the threat of defections is a serious problem for the Tories. There are some Tory MPs who are looking at losing their seats anyway. Quite frankly, for some of them, what's to be lost in defecting to Reform UK right now? If they're going to lose anyway, why not try a grift? Indeed, I did say so last week. However, it's not clear how they link Farage's return with another surge for Reform UK unless he formally aligns himself. Officially speaking, Nigel Farage has got nothing to do with Reform UK. We sort of know. I mean, the association's there because he was leader of the Brexit Party, which was the previous form of the party before it was rebanded. But he's got no formal role with Reform UK. You know, do they think he's planning to formalise this alliance with his old mucker Richard Tice? Is this why there's talk of Johnson and Farage together as a dream ticket? As for dominating the airways, I don't know. He'll be back on GB News, of course. But ITV already regret taking him on. Other outlets are unlikely to want to keep platforming him. I'm not sure how they think he'll suddenly gain a larger profile than he already had. You know, you could argue his profile was raised more widely during the banking row due to Sunak playing along with it. If the Tories learn their lesson and don't give outlets an excuse to report on anything Farage is doing, then he remains in his GBB's box. But I can also understand how, if you think your party is facing an existential threat, that you can also amplify those threats in your own mind. And MPs are not, as a breed, the best at data analysis or critical thinking. In fact, very often, especially as a Tory MP, their job depends on them not understanding data or any form of evidence. But what to do? If enough Tory MPs think that Johnson is the answer to their plight, then, well, they need to get him back into Parliament, don't they? So one possibility was getting him to stand in Wellingborough. Now, there's currently a recall petition for the sitting MP, Peter Bone. People expect it to be passed, meaning a by-election in the new year sometime, like February probably. The plan could see Johnson stand in the seat. However, there are 3 small flaws in this plan. The first is that Sunak could just block Johnson's candidacy. What would they do then? They can't threaten to bring him down because it would be obvious even to Sunak that they're doing it so they can replace him with Johnson again. Sunak is weak, but is he really stupid enough to go along with an obvious plan to replace him? There was one suggestion that is like, well, let's just replace Sunak with Priti Patel. Then Priti Patel be the caretaker leader while we work on getting Boris Johnson back into Parliament. But this all sounds absolutely ridiculous. That's surely too ridiculous even for Tories. The second problem is that Boris Johnson is still unpopular with the public. Don't matter what they think, you know, he really is. People haven't moved on. He's shit the bed with voters and that's that. The chances of Johnson winning what will be a very tough seat anyway is probably less than picking an unknown local candidate at random. The third problem is that Wellingborough is a bit of a bellwether seat. It's the sort of seat that does tend to flip to the party that's doing well nationally. So although it is slightly Conservative leading, when Labour are doing really well nationally, it does tend to go Labour. So even with Johnson's unpopularity with voters, this is not the seat to try and bring him back with. If they were able to bring him back with a by-election, their best bet would be to ask someone who's retiring anyway in a very safe seat, like his old seat of Henley. Like he lives in Henley at the moment. The current MP who took over from Johnson is retiring. Why doesn't he just step down early in return for the biggest suitcase of cash he's seen in his life or something? But that would still rely upon Sunak allowing in the shittest, most obvious Trojan horse in history. Oh, you want me to approve Boris Johnson as a candidate to become an MP? Why? Oh, so he can help support your leadership against these naughty rebels. I mean, Sunak is politically pretty dim, but he can't be that stupid. Another thought, which the Mail actually printed, was to say, well, the leader doesn't actually have to be an MP. I mean, they could just make him leader and then welcome him back to Parliament after the election. That was actually printed. That Dan Hodges even printed this is insane. I get that there might be a feeling that bringing Johnson back is their best shot. I think it's deluded and that they're conveniently forgetting certain things that have happened, but I get it. But the idea of making him leader without being an MP, if someone was genuinely dumb enough to say it, why publish it? It's the maddest idea yet. No, the leader technically doesn't have to be an MP. The Green Party's leaders are not MPs, for example. But for a party of power, they do. Look what happened when Sunak appointed Cameron as Foreign Secretary. Labour pointed out that this meant that Sunak didn't think there was anyone suitable for the job amongst 349 colleagues in the House of Commons. Well, imagine what Labour would say if they can't even say that any of the 350 are suitable to lead the party. That would be utterly farcical. But like I say, I don't know whether this is a common topic of serious discussion amongst MPs or whether the Mail are just inflating the opinion of like 3 MPs who were pissed at the time. You know, embellishing the reputation of their £1 million star signing. Maybe they want to get out of that. It's a very expensive contract. It's very ill-advised. The Mail are losing money. Maybe they're trying to get out of it and browbeat Tory MPs into getting him back so he can't write for them anymore. But although I appreciate the motivation to see Johnson as the lesser of many available evils, even though I think those Tory MPs are deluding themselves, they just don't have a credible way to make it happen. They need to accept that 2 things are not impossible, nothing's impossible in politics, but shall we say incredibly unlikely to happen before the election. They are spectacularly unlikely to send anyone to Rwanda other than government ministers. And they are magnificently unlikely to be able to make Boris Johnson their leader either. They would do themselves a huge favour if they based their plans on what is realistic. But then if they did that, they wouldn't be in this mess in the first place, would they? But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.